I still remember the sound of the laughter more than anything else. Not just my brother's laugh, but the way it spread around the table like something contagious. The way my sister-in-law covered her mouth with her napkin. The way my nephew looked down at his plate. It was Christmas Eve. The whole family was there. And my brother had just told everyone, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, that I was the cautionary tale he'd spent 30 years trying not to become. I'm 63 years old. I've been in manufacturing logistics most of my adult life. I have a daughter I'm proud of and a house I paid for and a quiet routine that suits me. None of that was visible to my brother that night. What he saw was exactly what he'd always chosen to see. He raised his glass and said, gesturing toward me with a grin that had never once been warm, to the man who proved that working hard and getting nowhere are not mutually exclusive. A few people laughed. Someone clinked glasses without fully understanding why. My brother leaned back in his chair, satisfied, and added, honestly, sometimes I think God put you on this earth just to make the rest of us look good. My sister-in-law laughed harder than anyone. I set down my fork. I folded my napkin. I said nothing. He mistook my silence for surrender. He always had. My brother is 58. He's 5 years younger than me and has spent the better part of those 5 years reminding everyone in our family of it. He built a regional distribution company in the early 2000s that did well enough to give him confidence that far outpaced the actual numbers. He drove a big truck, belonged to the right clubs, knew how to work a room. People liked him the way people like a man who seems certain of himself. It reads as strength until you know him long enough to see the seams. I was the opposite in most ways that were visible. I worked for other companies rather than building my own. I wore the same style of clothes I'd worn for 20 years. I drove a sensible car and lived in a modest house in a part of town my brother described, more than once, as fine for what it is. He said things like that constantly. Fine for what it is. You do what you can with what you've got. Must be nice to live without expectations. He never said I was a failure directly, the way a crueler man might. He was too smart for that. He just surrounded the subject until it suffocated. After our father passed 8 years ago, it got worse. Our father had left us each a portion of his estate, a mix of property and savings that wasn't enormous, but was meaningful. My brother handled the legal side of it because, as he'd told everyone repeatedly, I wasn't good with paperwork. I was tired then, grieving, stretched thin between work and managing my daughter's college expenses. When my brother presented me with the summary documents, I signed where he pointed and trusted what he summarized. It would be years before I understood what that trust had cost me. That Christmas Eve, after the laughter settled and conversation moved on to other things, I helped clear the table and said my goodbyes early. My daughter walked me to the door. She was the only one who noticed my face. You okay? She asked. I'm fine, I told her. Good dinner. She looked at me the way she sometimes did, like she was reading something in a language she almost understood. He's not worth it, Dad. I know, I said, and I meant it, or I thought I did. I drove home in the dark, down roads I knew so well I barely had to think about them. The heater ran, the radio stayed off. I sat with the quiet of the car and let myself feel the thing I'd been holding at arm's length for years. Not anger exactly. Something older and heavier. The specific weight of being known by people who have never once tried to understand you. My brother had been telling a version of me for 30 years. A version that needed his guidance, his connections, his occasional intervention. A version that validated his success by contrast. And I had let him. Not because I believed it, but because fighting it felt like a conversation that would never end and never land anywhere clean. I got home, made coffee I didn't drink, and sat at my kitchen table staring at nothing in particular until the clock above the stove read 12:41 a.m. Something had shifted, not into anger, into decision. The thing about my brother's version of me was that it had an audience. Family members who'd heard it so often, they repeated it without thinking. An aunt who asked, every Thanksgiving, whether I was getting by all right. A cousin who once sent me a job listing, thoughtfully, as if I'd been struggling to find work. My daughter's ex-boyfriend had once mentioned, casually, that he'd heard I'd had a hard go of things. He'd heard it from my nephew, who'd heard it from my brother. The story was self-sustaining. My silence had fed it. What I hadn't told anyone, because I had no interest in performing success for people who'd already made up their minds, was that the last several years had been quietly and steadily good. I'd spent 8 years at a logistics firm that had grown considerably under a division I'd helped build. I'd been promoted twice without applying for either position. I managed a team that was lean and effective, and I developed a reputation in the industry for solving problems that burned through other people's patience. None of this was glamorous. None of it made a good story at Christmas dinner, but it had added up. Methodically, month by month, in the way things do when you stop spending energy on appearances and put it somewhere useful. I had a financial advisor named Patricia who had been telling me for 3 years that I was in better shape than I seemed to believe. I kept modest habits because they suited me, not because I couldn't afford otherwise. My mortgage had been paid off for 2 years. My daughter's loans, the ones I'd taken on when her scholarship fell short, were gone. My savings had grown into something I had stopped measuring casually. I knew all of this. My brother did not. And that Christmas night, sitting alone in my kitchen, I decided something. Not a plan exactly. A direction. I wasn't going to confront him. That had never worked with my brother and never would. He was built for conflict the way a salesman is built for objection. Give him an argument and he'd find an angle. Give him an accusation and he'd turn it into a conversation about your character. What I was going to do was stop disappearing. I went back to work in January the same as always. Early mornings, long days, the kind of focus that makes time move in a useful direction. But something had changed in how I carried it. I stopped deflecting when people asked about my work. I started answering honestly. When my division landed a major contract in March, I let myself feel good about it without looking for somewhere to put the feeling away. And I started going through old paperwork. The files from my father's estate had lived in a box in my closet for 8 years, untouched because touching them meant returning to that year, which I hadn't been ready to do. I opened them in February, on a Sunday afternoon, with a cup of tea and the deliberate calm of someone who has decided to look at something clearly. It took me about an hour to find it. A property transfer, dated 11 days before I'd signed the summary documents. A parcel of land my father had owned along a commercial corridor, transferred out of the estate and into a holding company before the estate was finalized. A holding company whose registered agent was a name I didn't recognize, but whose address was 15 minutes from my brother's office. I sat with that for a long time. The land itself wasn't what mattered most in the immediate sense. What mattered was the pattern. My brother had managed the paperwork. My brother had presented me with a summary. My brother had said, more than once, "You don't need to worry about this part. I've already handled it." I called my daughter that evening. I didn't tell her what I'd found. I asked if she still knew the estate attorney she'd used when she and her ex-husband had separated. She gave me the name. I called him the next morning. 3 weeks later, he called me back. The attorney's name was Gerald, and he had a voice that sounded like someone who had heard most things twice already and still took notes. He'd pulled the county records, cross-referenced the transfer dates, compared the summary documents I'd signed to the full estate inventory. His voice was even when he called, but careful. "The transfer happened before probate closed," he said, "which means it should have been included in the estate inventory you received." It wasn't. "How much was the land worth?" I asked. He gave me a number. It wasn't enormous in the way of life-changing windfalls, but it was significant. It was the kind of money that would have changed the years that followed my father's death in ways I could measure. It would have removed the pressure that had made certain decisions necessary. It would have given me options I'd instead had to build towards slowly. It was also, Gerald said, the kind of discrepancy that didn't resolve itself accidentally. "What are my options?" I asked. He walked me through them. Civil suit, estate dispute, demand letter, timelines, costs, outcomes. He was honest about the uncertainty and the length of any formal process. I thanked him and told him I'd think about it. I thought about it for 3 weeks, not with anger, which surprised me. What I felt was closer to the thing I'd felt sitting at my kitchen table on Christmas night. Clarity. The story my brother had been telling about me suddenly had a footnote I hadn't known to read. He hadn't just talked his way into looking better. He had quietly engineered a version of events where his advantage was structural, and then spent 8 years performing generosity about the gap. I called Gerald back and told him I wanted to proceed. Not through litigation immediately, but through a formal demand letter, documented and sent via certified mail, giving my brother the opportunity to respond before anything escalated. Gerald recommended the same approach. The letter went out on a Tuesday in April. My brother called me the following Friday. He didn't mention the letter at first. He asked how I was doing, which he almost never did. He mentioned a family barbecue he was planning for the summer. He talked about his son's new job. His voice had a quality I'd never heard in it before. Careful. Managed. Then he said, "Did you send me something through a lawyer?" "I did," I said. Silence. "That property," he started. "Gerald has the records," I said. "The transfer dates, the holding company registration, the inventory summary you gave me. I'm not going to argue about it." He tried twice more. Both times I said, "Gerald has the records." By the end of the call, his voice had changed entirely. Still controlled but narrow, like a door with too much furniture pushed against it. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want what was mine," I said. "And I want you to stop telling people a story about me that was designed to make what you took less visible." He hung up. That was in April. May came and went quietly. My daughter and I drove up to Vermont for a long weekend. I hiked more than I had in years and slept well and ate breakfast at a place that made proper biscuits. On the drive home, she asked me what was different. I told her I'd been thinking through some old things. She nodded like she understood more than I'd said, which she probably did. Gerald reached a settlement agreement in June. My brother acknowledged the discrepancy and agreed to a structured resolution. No court, no press, no extended drama. My brother's attorney negotiated the terms carefully, which told me that on some level, my brother had known exactly what he'd done for exactly 8 years. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolved. There's a difference. What I hadn't decided yet was what to do about the wider story, the one that had circulated through family gatherings and casual conversations for 3 decades, the one where I was the footnote and he was the main event. Gerald's documents took care of the financial part, but the narrative was a different kind of property. The answer came to me in July, not as a plan but as an opportunity. My brother hosted his annual 4th of July barbecue at his house, a large colonial in the kind of neighborhood where everyone has an American flag and a Ring doorbell. He'd hosted it for 15 years. It was the largest gathering of our extended family in the calendar year, 40 or 50 people on a good day. Our aunt, both cousins, our sister who drove down from Vermont, 3 generations of people who had absorbed my brother's version of things over time. He invited me. He always did. Possibly because not inviting me would have raised questions. Possibly because some part of him needed me present. I brought my daughter and a pie she'd made from blueberries we'd picked in Vermont. The afternoon was warm and bright, the kind of July day that is hard to resent. Kids ran through the sprinklers. Someone had set up a cornhole game near the fence. My brother moved through the yard with the comfortable authority of a man in his own territory, hand on shoulders, head thrown back when he laughed. He noticed me arrive. Our eyes met briefly. He nodded once and turned back to his conversation. I found my sister near the food table. She is 4 years older than me and the most direct person in our family. She hugged me and handed me a cold drink without asking if I wanted one. "You look different," she said. "Good different or bad different?" She studied me for a moment. "Settled," she said. "Like you, put something down." I didn't say anything to that, but I felt it. The afternoon moved at the easy pace of summer gatherings. I talked with cousins I hadn't spoken to in a year. My daughter found a group of younger relatives and disappeared into their orbit. I ate well and stayed calm, and didn't feel the familiar tension I usually carried to these events. It was early evening, the light going golden through the trees, when my brother found me near the back of the yard with a small group that included our aunt, one of our cousins, and my sister. He was in a good mood, loose and confident, the way he got after a few drinks and an afternoon of being admired in his own backyard. "There he is," he said, arriving with his arm already reaching to clap me on the shoulder. "The man of mystery. You've been quiet today. That's unusual." Then he smiled at the group and added, "Of course, quiet is kind of his specialty. Always has been. It's easier to stay quiet when you don't have much to report." A couple of people laughed, a little awkward, a little reflexive. My cousin smiled with her eyes somewhere else. I looked at my brother. "Actually," I said, "I've had quite a bit going on." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? What's new in the world of—" "I bought out a stake in a smaller logistics firm in March," I said. "We closed the deal quietly. It'll be announced publicly in August." The yard didn't go silent. Conversations continued around us, but the group we were standing in did. My brother's smile stayed on his face, but it stopped moving. "We've been profitable every quarter since 2019, I continued, not raising my voice, "and the acquisition puts us in a position to bid on some regional government contracts we've been working toward for 2 years. My aunt looked between us, trying to read the room. I didn't know you were, my brother started. No, I agreed. You didn't. My sister was watching me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face in years. My brother laughed, shorter this time. Well, that's great. That's really great. He said it the way people say things when they're deciding what it means. You could have mentioned something. I could have, I said, but you'd been telling people what I was for a long time. I didn't see the need to interrupt. The laugh this time didn't happen. He looked at me directly. Behind the ease, behind the confidence, something calculated was running. This is because of the letter, he said, lowering his voice. No, I said, same volume, no lower. The firm has nothing to do with the letter. Those are two separate things. One is what you did, the other is what I did. I wanted the people here to understand the difference. My cousin had stopped pretending to look away. My aunt said very carefully, "What letter?" My brother's jaw moved. I watched him decide not to answer. There was a discrepancy in Dad's estate, I said to my aunt, keeping my voice even, no heat in it. Some property that should have been included in my share wasn't. Gerald Howell documented it. It's been resolved. The silence around us was a different kind now. My sister said, "James." A single word in a voice I hadn't heard from her since we were children. The kind of voice that doesn't need to be loud. My brother turned to her. "It's more complicated than—" "I'm sure it is," she said. "It always is." He looked back at me. For the first time in 30 years, I couldn't identify the emotion on his face. It wasn't anger exactly. It wasn't the performance of confidence either. It was something rawer than that. Something that had just lost the context it needed to exist. "You've been planning this," he said. "I've been building something," I said. "There's a difference." I didn't wait for his response. I set my drink down on the nearby table and went to find my daughter, who was laughing about something with a second cousin near the cornhole game. She looked up when I approached. "Ready?" I said. She read my face. "Yeah, let me get the pie dish." We said our goodbyes to the people who mattered. My aunt held my hand for a moment when I hugged her and looked at me like she wanted to say something but was still finding the words. My sister walked me to my car and stood there while my daughter went ahead. "How long have you known?" she asked. "About the estate." 8 months, I said. "About what he'd done? About everything else? Longer?" She nodded slowly. "I should have seen it." "You weren't supposed to," I said. "He was careful." She looked at me for a long moment. "I'm sorry I laughed at his jokes." "You didn't know what they were paying for," I said. She hugged me, tight and brief, and went back inside. I drove home in the late summer evening with the windows down. My daughter sat in the passenger seat and didn't ask what had happened, which meant she'd understood most of it already. Somewhere past the highway ramp, she said, "I'm proud of you, Dad." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "That means a lot." She nodded and looked out the window, and we drove the rest of the way home in the comfortable quiet of people who don't need to fill every silence. The fallout was slower and quieter than I expected. My aunt called 2 days later. My cousin sent a text that was brief and honest, something like, "I didn't know any of that. I'm sorry I was never curious enough to ask." My nephew, my brother's son, called 2 weeks later. He was embarrassed in the way young people get when they realize a story they've been handed doesn't hold. I told him it wasn't his to carry, and I meant it. My brother didn't call. He sent me an email in August, the same week our acquisition was announced in an industry publication. The email was 3 sentences. He said he hadn't expected things to land the way they had. He said he thought he was protecting the estate from complications. He said he hoped we could talk at some point. I read it twice. I wrote back, "When you're ready to be honest about what you did and why, I'll listen." Not before. I didn't hear back. That was fine. My daughter and I went back to Vermont in September. We hiked the same trails we'd walked in May, and the leaves had turned by then, orange and gold in the early morning light. We ate at the same breakfast place. The biscuits were just as good. On the last morning, sitting on the porch of the rental cabin, with coffee going cold in my hands, I thought about the long stretch of years between the man I'd been at family dinners, quiet and reduced, and carrying something I couldn't name, and the man sitting in that chair. It hadn't been a straight line. Most of it had been invisible to anyone watching, but it had been mine. Every quiet decision, every month of careful work, every morning I chose building over bitterness. Mine. I thought about what my brother had said at Christmas, about me being the cautionary tale, about God putting me on earth to make other people look good. He'd said it because he believed it. He'd believed it because I'd let the silence mean something it never did. I wasn't angry at him anymore. Not because what he'd done was small, it wasn't, but because anger would have required giving him a place in my story he no longer occupied. Some people mistake your patience for their proof. They watch you not shout and decide it means they were right. They watch you build carefully and call it drifting because they can't see the foundation from where they're standing. I had spent 30 years being someone else's cautionary tale. I had spent the last 8 months becoming something else entirely, not because I needed anyone to see it, but because I owed it to myself to stop colluding in a version of my own life that was never true. If you've ever had a person in your family who told your story louder than you did and told it wrong, I want you to understand something. You don't have to argue with them. You don't have to correct every room they've already been in. You don't have to perform your life for an audience that decided the ending before the middle was done. What you owe yourself is simpler and harder than any of that. You owe yourself the truth, built solid enough that it doesn't need your voice to carry it. Silence is not losing. Sometimes it's the only strategy that actually works. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me what part landed. And if you want to keep hearing stories about the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, consider staying with us. There are more where this came from, and I hope you'll be here when they arrive.